Good morning, everyone. How are we? Yeah, good. Listen, thanks so much for joining us here this morning. The title of this session is The Future of Work in the AI Age. And I just want to clarify here, we're not talking about just the future of jobs. This is not a discussion where we're going to make predictions about exactly what occupations are going to be here in 5 or 10 years and which are going to disappear. We're talking really more about the quality and the way that artificial intelligence is shifting both the labor market, demand and supply, for how jobs are demanded, what skills are incorporated in there. We'll also touch on the issue of fairness, of diversity and inclusion, and who is disproportionately or otherwise impacted by the shifts and the use of artificial intelligence in many ways. And in the third act of this discussion, we're really going to focus on what can we do about it. And when I say we, I mean, what can you do about it? Because as leaders in organizations, you are the decision makers who are more and more deploying commercial artificial intelligence solutions and having an impact on workforces. So that's really the scope of today, and we have 3 fantastic panelists that I'm going to ask to come out on stage now. The first is Sarah Franklin. Sarah is an Executive Vice President and the GM of Trailhead here at Salesforce. Welcome, Sarah. We've got James Manyika, who's the chairman and director of the McKinsey Global Institute, published very widely in this area. Thank you, James. And we've got Timnit Gebru. Timnit is a researcher at Google Brain and the technical co-lead of ethical AI at Google. So Timnit, welcome. So let's start big picture. Let's narrow down to the human being at the center of our discussions in the future of work. And then let's think about action and what we can and should do individually or collectively. So let me start here with a big picture with you, James. How should we be thinking and framing this tricky question about what work looks like, what jobs look like in the future, thanks to the incredible opportunities offered by technologies such as artificial intelligence?
Well, thanks, Nick. I'm delighted to be here, although I can't really see anybody in the audience because it's so dark out there. But anyway, I think when we think about AI, first of all, it's important to recognize that this is actually an extraordinary time. I mean, we've made so much progress in AI in the last 5 years or 10 years, much more than the last 50 years. So, of course, these questions about work become very important to us. And I think it's important to recognize when we think about work, rather than start with jobs, we should think about activities and tasks, because what we all do is actually composed of tasks and activities. In fact, if we take any of our occupations, they're made up of a variety of tasks that we do every day, and AI and other automation technologies are starting to be able to automate those tasks. So if you take something like, and we've looked at this, if you look at something like over 2,000 activities and tasks that make up what people do in the economy, and you look at what's now possible to automate based on AI and automation technologies, you very quickly come to the conclusion that it looks like it's going to be possible to automate close to about half the tasks that people do. That's a lot, but it's important to recognize these are tasks, not jobs, but tasks, because any job is made up of constituent activities. So if you then take this task view and then you try and map it back into occupations. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, tracks about 828 occupation categories. If you map these back to those occupations, you suddenly realize that something like about 10% of occupations look like they have the majority, nearly 100% of their tasks that can be automated. 10%.
And that's based on current technology or some futuristic development?
So this is based on currently demonstrated technologies, which means it's either an actual product or somebody's actually demonstrated in a lab somewhere that this can actually be done. But what you also realize very quickly is that something like about 60% of occupations have about a third of their constituent activities that can be automated. What does that mean? Well, that actually means that many more occupations are going to be augmented by technology that will be automated away. So this is one of the pictures that emerges when you start to look at this task view. But I should also say, of course, it's natural to wonder, so are we facing a jobless future or not? And I think what we conclude, at least on the research that we've done and also that of many others, is that, yes, of course, there'll be jobs lost, but there'll also be jobs gained, but also jobs changed. And in some ways, the jobs that are going to be gained and changed are probably a much larger number. So if you ask me, do I worry about a jobless future? I actually don't. That's actually the least of my worries. I worry about a whole bunch of other things, and let me just summarize the things that I worry about. I worry about the fact that we're going to have significant occupation shifts as we see some jobs and occupations decline and others rise. So how do we enable and support workers as they transition from occupation to occupation? I worry about that because we don't do that very well. I also worry about the skill shifts because as these occupations, as some decline, some grow, and also many, many are changed, the skill requirements are going to be quite substantial. So how do we do that quickly enough? Then I also worry about the wage implications. I think if we think we have a income inequality challenge, it may actually get worse because the effects of when machines start to complement people and also when we start to have some occupations decline and others grow, many of the ones that are going to grow, not all of them, many of them happen to be ones that we don't pay very much for these days. So I worry about the wage implications of the transitions. Those are the things I worry about.
Could you say a little bit more then on this question of which skills are in demand or likely to be in demand that would be able to help people in the affected occupations, so those with declining demand, shift to occupations or occupations with activities that are more resistant and resilient to automation?
Yeah, well, it's actually quite clear the ones that are not going to be in demand, at least where the demand is going to decline. So machines are going to be very, very good at anything that involves data analysis, data collection, or doing fairly routine tasks. So occupations where those dominate are probably going to decline. But at the same time, the ones that are going to grow in demand are certainly a lot of technical skills that require complex technical thinking, digital skills, and so forth. But we're also going to have occupations that involve the relatively hard to automate activities, things that require cognitive, emotional, experiential, judgment, those kinds of skills. The demand for that is going to grow. I think there's still a real question out there, just to provoke it a little bit about, we already have many occupations where those skills are very much in demand. We still don't pay very much for them. Teachers, for example. Yeah. We don't pay teachers very much, but they involve all those very complex cognitive, emotional skills.
And let's touch a little bit more before I ask for the other panelists to come in and comment or challenge you on some of this. What's driving organizations, what's driving enterprise to actually make the changes we're talking about? Why would an organization, and when McKinsey works with organizations on data and analytics, why do they say, I really want to adopt an artificial intelligence, a kind of a very advanced algorithmic solution to this? Is it the bottom line? Is it that they're sick of dealing with labor costs and unions? What's driving this picture from the commercial aspect?
Well, I think it's a variety of things. On the one hand, in many cases, these algorithms are actually better. They're just more efficient, they do better predictions, better insights. So the business benefits in that sense, at least, are often quite clear, especially when you look at industries where you're starting to deal with trying to discover new solutions that are very hard. So if you're doing, for example, if you're in pharmaceuticals, you're trying to do drug discovery, for example, we know that when you're trying to think about protein folding, proteomics, genomics, the kinds of solution spaces or inventive outcomes we can come up with are only possible with these techniques. So whether it's driven by efficiency or discovery or innovation reasons, I think the reasons for businesses are relatively clear. Similarly, I think the benefit to the economy is also relatively clear, because what happens is, think about it, the way the economy grows, economies grow because you have productivity growth, and automation technologies have always made a big contribution and will make a big contribution to productivity growth. So at a time when we're worrying about sluggish economic growth and lackluster productivity growth, we're also there's a real reason to embrace these technologies. But I think these workforce implications are what we're going to need to navigate and grapple with, even as companies embrace this. So I think companies have this interesting conundrum now, especially if you're a very large footprint company where you employ a lot of people, where on the one hand, you do want to embrace these technologies because they drive business performance, growth, innovation, all these things. But at the same time, you now need to start to think about the workforce implications. But keep in mind, the workforce implications are not just about replacing people. They're also about even how do you augment people? How do you complement what people do? How do you redesign work? How do you redesign workflow? How do you skill and retrain people? There's a lot to think about on the workforce front for companies.
So let me bring Sarah into this in terms of giving a perspective from Salesforce.
Yes.
You have a series of products that are driven by artificial intelligence, Einstein most notably, and all that sits behind it. You also, you're GM of Trailhead, which is the, both internal and externally, a fantastic LMS, a learning management system, and way of training. Now 1 million people around the world, I think, users of Trailhead at the moment. But how does this look in terms of the link between what you're doing at Salesforce and the impact and adoption of artificial intelligence by the company? How does what James resonate with you, or do you see a completely different picture from internally?
Yes, Nick, and great question. And what you said, James, very much resonates. When you look at Salesforce, we have technology, for example, for customer service. And you talk about AI, and you talk about bots, and you saw this great demonstration of automation of a customer experience, an amazing and delightful customer experience. So then you wonder, okay, is that going to be a lost job for the service rep, right? Because you have bots handling these. What we see is this is actually, as James said, a huge opportunity, because you need the person that has the cognition and that has that knowledge of what an experience could be. And you want to make sure that you're delivering not just knowledge, but an experience to the customer on the other end. And these technologies provide us the ability to really make these experiences incredible, because a computer can learn so much more than maybe I have. I speak one language. I barely speak Spanish and French. You don't want me to speak it here. But I can't speak German. I can't speak Japanese, but a computer could. And so by having a computer being able to, or AI able to do this for you, you're able to deliver a better experience. But you need to be able to have these computers be aware and human in their behavior. And so from a standpoint of jobs, you need to be able to bring the people to the new jobs. And that's with Trailhead. It's all about saying, you have a ton of customer service knowledge. You might not be an AI programmer, but we're going to skill you up and create the technology where you don't have to code to do it. And you can take that knowledge and configure that into the machine. And so that brings the people to the jobs, and that's what really we look at. We don't want to automate anybody out of a job. In the next 2 years, according to World Economic Forum, a third of the new jobs that are in demand are going to be new. Mm-hmm. And so that's an amazing opportunity. And what we have to do is continuously say, how do we bring people to those jobs and not just automate them out of it?
Right. And so I think, James, you've mentioned before that there's this middle category of around 60% of jobs where a third of the tasks or around about that will change. And it sounds, Sarah, that what you're saying is a lot of the people in the room or who are watching this online will probably be in that category where adopting a new way of working will require them to be augmented by technologies, different forms of analytic, like Einstein in the system, and learning to use those to be higher productivity is an important shift for them and their careers, but also for their organizations.
Absolutely, and it makes it so that the jobs become more satisfying as well, because if a job is somewhat, if it's only redundant and repetitive, there's not as much opportunity to expand. And so this actually provides a lot more opportunity to bring more creativity and just opportunity to the job that you're doing, right, because you get to expand because the technology is allowing you to do that.
But just to add to that, one of the things that's both exciting and challenging about what you just described is the fact that we're probably going to be able to do more satisfying, more interesting work as we work alongside machines and so forth. But that also puts an imperative on picking up new skills, because the machines that we're working alongside themselves are going to be getting better and better and better. And in fact, you find wide variations across organizations and companies, or even countries for that matter, in terms of how much effort goes towards on-the-job training, on-the-job skilling. And that's going to be one of the interesting challenges, I think.
So let's start to, this has been a great rosy picture of why productivity is a core reason here, why there are lots of commercial reasons why organizations want to and will adopt new technology, and opportunities for increased worker satisfaction, and in some cases, increased wages that go with higher productivity.
Not so fast, right? We should come back.
So yeah, but you said there were these three problems. We have to worry about occupational shifts, we have to worry about skills shift, we have to worry about wage shifts. And there are, as we talked about earlier, James, there are many occupations which are skewed in terms of demographics in different ways. There are many occupations, and I was talking with someone here at Salesforce yesterday who was explaining that in the call center market, there are around 15 million jobs, call center positions around the world. The technology could, in the next 2 years or 3 years or so, automate about 20% of those jobs. And in South Asia, those jobs are disproportionately held by young women who have those jobs as the first really rung on the professional ladder, providing for their families, providing independence, a fantastic opportunity that then will be moved away because of the way that the automation works. There's also a deeper set of concerns within the use of artificial intelligence, which is the fact that all algorithms are inherently biased. They can be biased because of the data they're trained on, biased the way they're designed, biased by the way that they're implemented, and the context in which the results are interpreted. And Timnit, that's something that you work on with Google. You worked on that also with Microsoft Research, and it was a feature. The social aspects of this were a feature also of your PhD, as I understand it, as well. When you hear this big picture piece on the future of work and artificial intelligence, bring it down to the human level. What do we need to be looking out for in the way that artificial intelligence is applied, and how it can, extend people, but also how it can exclude and discriminate?
So I hear many different perspectives on the big picture. Like, I talk to research scientists or AI researchers like Joshua, for example, and a lot of them talk about universal basic income and things like this. So it's good to hear different perspectives. And I don't agree with these big doomsday scenarios like the singularity or robots taking over our jobs or just killing us all kind of situation. But I do think about things that are less glamorous but more important, I think. And so, as you mentioned, in our day-to-day lives, there are algorithms that are being used in many different scenarios, that things that I don't even know about, that I find out kind of every day when I give a talk. I find out something new, And so there is some. So I'll give an example of, you were talking about very different languages, right? So sometimes just the errors in translation. And how those errors are made can result in very significant high stakes scenarios for people. So one example is that this guy woke up one day, and he's Palestinian, and he wrote "Good morning" in Arabic on Facebook, and it was translated to attack them. And so a few things happened. He got arrested. And so he was later released, right? So there's a few things that happened here. One is the fact that, so you mentioned, certain occupations are, there's a skewed demographics that happens to be my occupation. There's very few women and no black people, almost none, except we started this group called Black in AI. But anyway, so because of this skew, there are problems that people focus on. So they focus on some problems more than others. So when you look at language translation and natural language processing tools for Western-centric languages have received a lot of attention. And English to French translation, for example, is great. even though it has, of course, it has some errors. But something like Arabic, which has many dialects and is spoken by so many different people, still has these errors that, I mean, good morning versus attack them, that's a very different translation, right? So then, so I'm just walking you through this to hit a few different points. So people who, there's these systematic errors, but then there's a second thing going on, because the people who are most likely to be negatively impacted by these systematic errors also are, those people whose, languages and things are not very well studied, right? So in this case, it happens to be this Palestinian guy. And then he was arrested because people didn't even check to see the original Arabic, what he wrote, right? And that is something we call automation bias. So Ayanna Howard at Georgia Tech studies this a lot, where people tend to trust algorithms, and we don't apply these critical thinking skills the same way that we would with human beings. So she did this experiment where she even had students, the robots leading students through burning buildings towards a burning building. If I was leading you guys towards a burning building, you'd be like, no, I'm not going to follow you, you're crazy. But that's not what they did. Students would just follow the robot towards a burning building through obstacles, because they were just thinking that this robot knows best. Mm-hmm. So we have that automation bias. And so the reason I wanted to hit on these, and so of course my own research has shown that so with Joy, that commercial gender classification systems, face recognition systems in general have high disparities in error rates for darker skinned individuals, especially women, and things like this, right? And so then in that case, you also see in the US, who are the people who are most likely to be over-policed, and who are the people who are also experiencing discrimination not in the algorithmic sense, right? So there's a real danger of systematizing the discrimination that we have in society. And so what I think we need to do is, as we're kind of moving into this world where we have all these invisible kind of algorithms everywhere, is that, for example, even for translation, we have to be very explicit about, we kind of have to have disclaimers about what our error rates can be like. So for example, in my research, we have this paper called Data Sheets for Data Sets. So imagine, let me give you the example of this face recognition system, right? So it's been in the news lately a lot because police are using face recognition. Different, ICE and different tech companies have been partnering with police and selling technology, right? Now, imagine the high disparities in error rates that were shown in our research. When we were looking at, let's say a README or a documentation, there was nothing that said, here's the distribution of training data for our errors. If you're going to use it for individuals between 30 and 40 coming from this background looking like this, it might be okay. But please don't use it for high-stakes scenarios like determining who's going to go to prison, who's going to get a job. There's nothing that says something like that, right? So one of the recommendations that I have, and that some of my colleagues and researchers have, is to have something called a data sheet for data sets, or something for pre-trained models and APIs and things that we release into the world, just kind of giving guidelines and disclaimers and some kind of any sort of information about it.
I think this is a critical point, because for the people listening to this and people in the audience, there's going to be a good smattering of people who are at the frontier of AI research themselves, who are understanding the nuance of the training set, the test set, the validation set, et cetera, and who'll be able to say, okay, I can maybe tweak my methods a little bit to incorporate this. But there's going to be many more people who are adopting commercial APIs with sophisticated algorithms behind who don't have the ability to interrogate them, and in many cases, with proprietary products, don't have any legal or practical means of accessing the code or the data set behind it in any case. So what do we do with this situation where we worry about these things, but at the same time, we're starting to package up, sell, and distribute in various forms, open source or otherwise, these capabilities without the data sheets at the moment? And James, I know you want to jump in here.
No, I was going to say, first of all, to agree with everything you just described. In fact, in some ways, one of the things that often people don't realize, and this is actually work that your PhD advisor, Feifei, worked on in ImageNet when we're classifying images, which is you suddenly realize in a lot of the research, many people are using the same training data sets. And so that they can often get then proliferated. So there's the CFAR data set, and there's all these standard data sets that everybody uses. But I think now we're only starting to understand that there may, in fact, be inherent, often collection biases in those data sets. But I think it's also important to recognize, because sometimes when this question of bias comes up, people often argue two sides of it. And I think at some level they're both true. They're both worth recognizing. One argument tends to be, well, algorithms will actually help us get beyond human biases. And so the people will cite all these examples of work that's been done on judges, for example, that says, well, judges, when they're making bail decisions, they make better decisions in the morning before lunch, whereas if they make them after lunch, they're not as good, and they're biased. So by using algorithms, we get past that. I think that is true. There are some places where using these techniques that don't get biased by time of day, are you tired, are you not, is a good thing. But I think it's also important to recognize the other side, which is what you were describing, which is when we then draw on data sets whose collection often is biased in itself, not because anybody intended that, but because society may be set up that way. So I'll give you two very different examples where oversampling can be a problem in one case and a good thing in another case. So you give the example of policing, right? We know that certain neighborhoods are over-policed, and so therefore the volume of data available is just so much higher. And so therefore, when you use those data sets to make predictions, of course it's going to predict that people in those over-policed environments are probably criminals. I'll give you another example, which is on the other side. Say, take lending, for example. It's been shown that in lending, for example, the oversampled data sets, where we just have a lot more data about the number of transactions, credit card transactions that they have, will actually help that population because there's so much more that we know about them, so it's easy to make predictions that are more trusting of that population, whereas the undersampled population, we make bad decisions. So I think understanding all these nuances I think are all very, very important. I think the data sheets and the methods that are now starting to come up are very, very important ones. I should also say, though, that some progress is being made through the kind of work you're doing, the kind of work that people like Sylvia Chiappa are doing, looking at counterfactual fairness models, for example, to try and detect these biases. I think we're going to make progress on these issues.
Sorry. I'm glad you brought up the two sides, because there are a lot of people, especially in the Harvard Business School or in other business schools, talk about, they've done research even in hiring and talk about how people's bias, they were able to reduce bias. So one example is this company called HireVue, which, so HireVue has over 600 customers. I don't know if Salesforce is a customer, but and they, Nike is one, and they range from many different educational institutions, technological institutions, etc. And so what HireVue does is it automates screening of resumes. So instead of thousands and thousands of recruiters looking through resumes, it automates the screening of resumes to decide who's going to be considered for an interview. And then they also have a second tool. This one lets you record people while they're being interviewed, and then they do emotion recognition on them, and then they give the interviewer additional information about you. So I talked to people who were interviewed on camera, and I asked, did you know this was like, did you know someone was doing emotion recognition on you? And so there are two, and so what HireVue says is that, some people have said that they were able to have a more diverse workforce after they used HireVue. So my issue with this is that there's two things. It might be true, but you have this one company. I know that the government of UAE is also using HireVue, like the Minister of Science and Technology was saying that. So you have this one algorithm, that everyone is going to be screened through. And if there's one glitch, one sort of bias, then now I just don't get a job anywhere, right? So I believe that it might be true, but we need to have some sort of, I don't know if it's a governmental body or a standardization body like the FDA or something that screens these things before they're deployed everywhere.
Well, I think, James, you mentioned the word nuance earlier. And Timnit, you're bringing in a lot of nuance to the discussion here, because it's not like we can say, well, the solution to solve for is wage inequality between the jobs destroyed and the jobs that are created on this macro level. Nor is it simply just a matter of, here are the identifiable biases within data sets. We just need to get more data on minority groups, and once we plug that, everything will be fine. No, there's no panacea here. There are a set of challenges that come with inherently adopting new strategies for making judgments. And I think you mentioned this, Timnit, which is the more sensitive the judgments you're making about people, if they are literally life-changing, related to security, related to hiring as well is a very sensitive subject, but particularly related to justice, criminal justice, the burden on organizations and the burden on the organizations producing and selling that material, as well as those deploying it, we would expect that to be higher in the same way that we have regulation in other industries. Within Google, as a member of the team, Google as an organization, which published, the blog post recently published 7 principles for the ethical use of artificial intelligence. How is this translating into the way that Google Brain is creating and developing products? And I know that you've recently joined Google, but you have had experience with a number of different companies, Apple, Microsoft, now Google. What is this? How is this shifting in terms of the culture of the developers and the product developers inside these companies?
Well, so I just joined Google. So there's a caveat there. But I can tell you that everywhere, in the last year, so many things have changed. Towards the end of my PhD, around, let's say, 2016, I was still doing a PhD, and I read the ProPublica article that most people here probably know about, right?
Julia Angwin did the work.
Yes,
right?
exactly. And at that time, I just met Joy Buolamwini at MIT, and she had been talking about how these vision systems were not recognizing her, her face, etc. And I was trying to explain to people what we were doing, why I partnered with her, why I thought it was important, and it was kind of difficult to explain to people and to have them understand the importance of it. And then in the last year, the press has been all over this, and Kamala Harris just wrote, to the FBI and all these people. So just within the last year, not just within companies, but civil society, there's been a lot of attention. And I think that this this spotlight from the outside helps, because what happens is often there might be people within companies who were thinking about it a while ago, and then when the spotlight happens, then these people get more visibility, and they get more. As they get more visibility, their voices get heard more, and then now these organizations start to understand that actually you have to take this very, very seriously. You have to take it. It's a similar type of transition that happened with security and privacy, right? So initially, people, when they had security and privacy breaches, there wasn't this culture of immediately disclosing it, and now every product has to go through a security check and privacy check. There's whole groups of people, you pay bounties for hackers, things like this, right? And I feel like a similar type of transition is happening in the fairness world just now, like right about now, where companies are having whole organizations, they're auditing algorithms for fairness, going through different checks, trying to think about how to infuse it into all of the products around the companies.
And I want to bring in Sarah in a second as we start to switch to the third act and talk about, well, then, what are the strategies that we can do to skill up in all these areas we've talked about. But before I go there, I kind of want to make another question to you, Timnit, about this question of nuance when it comes to the pressure that's on organizations using artificial intelligence or using technology in any way. We had the memo, the Google memo on the principles of AI that came after controversy around Project Maven and other questions, which clearly answered that question. We've had other situations more recently and before, but in the popular press, they tend to get reduced down to a yes or no, a very binary decision of should we be doing this or should we not. The real world is much more complex, I would argue, in the deployment and use of these technologies. And each of you in the audience or watching, when you're engaging with this is not a simple matter of should I do it or should I not. It's a question of how do I make sense of and deploy it in that sensitive kind of human-centered way. I just wonder if there's any comments from the panel on some of those kind of ethical issues du jour that are really kind of roiling the valley in ways and raising this issue up, to senior executives. And I hope then also supporting investment in groups like yours and Fate at Microsoft and other areas. But any kind of comments there on this question of the ethical use of artificial intelligence and how it's shifting the work environment?
Well, one observation, which, it is the case, I think it is true that there's starting to be a bit of a collective peer pressure building on these issues. So one instance of this is the recently formed partnership on AI, which Salesforce is a member, but the founding members included Google, DeepMind, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, etc. And that the partnership was necessarily set up in a way that also includes, so the ACLU, for example, is on the board of the partnership. The reason I mention that is that you're starting to see groups like that are kind of peer pressure or peer groups start to emerge and start to develop principles. So if anybody's interested, it's actually worth going to the Partnership on AI's website. They've actually got a set of principles that are supposed to be a collective guide. They're not prescriptive rules as in yes or no, but at least they are principles that the membership of that partnership are kind of signing up to say, we'd like to try and operate this way for all this to turn out well. So I think you're starting to see such principles emerge. Because if that doesn't happen, we're going to have them kind of be embedded in regulations. You've already seen what's happened with GDPR, for example, that now requires certain aspects of this to be built in. We talked about bias, but there's also questions about explainability, which is required, which is really, really important, by the way, when it comes to these algorithms. So I think some combination of groups self-policing, peer pressure, as well as, unfortunately, there'll be some regulatory pressure on it, I think will nudge this. I just hope that we don't overdo any of these things and recognize the nuance and the fact that these technologies are still evolving. We're still learning these things.
And when you say overdo, you mean let's not rush into completely banning an area of research and give up the productivity gains. Is that what you're implying by overdoing?
Oh yeah, okay. For sure. I think it'd be a mistake to say let's put the genie back in the box. I don't think you can do that anyway. And there's enough compelling reasons for businesses and the economy to want to embrace these technologies. It's much more about how do we manage these challenges and issues that we have.
So just I pause as I go to Sarah to talk about, well, what do we do and what is Salesforce doing and what are others doing to start to kind of redress the skills gap issue here in the future of work. And the pause is really, Timnit, you mentioned Joy. That's Joy Bulawini's work. There's Cathy O'Neill's work on weapons of mass destruction. Virginia Eubank's automating inequality, which is 3 harrowing case studies of looking at how this is applied in the public sector. There are other great examples. The ProPublica article on sentencing and bail guidelines, etc. So if you're interested in that area, I think that this is a really important piece of nuance to bring up. It's a complicating one when it comes to, well, now we're dealing with multiple kind of intersections of different issues. We need to think about skills more broadly. We need to think about skills particularly for those who are most affected by jobs that are in declining, kind of occupations declining because of automation. And we need to make sure that there's a thoughtfulness and judgment that comes into anyone that's developing or deploying these technologies. I guess Trailhead is the solution to all of this, Sarah.
Of course.
Talk us through it.
Trailhead is the solution to everything. I do want to say, just step back and just say first, how happy it makes me that we're having these conversations and how important these conversations are. We're on the verge of something, which is important that we always have that open mindset to always be learning and to always be understanding what the nuance may be. And even on the matter of diversity and inclusion itself, there's a lot of education there that still needs to be done. There's a lot of unconscious bias in the world without the computers, and even without automation, we have problems where in tech, just with women, our population's 48% and it's only like 18% women in the tech industry. That's without having bias from computers. And so we have a lot of work of education to do still to help people understand how to not do cultural appropriation, how to be inclusive, how to do all those things. And so first, you have to educate people on that. And then, as companies, it's our responsibility. If you saw in the opening keynote with Mark, he shared, as Salesforce, we have our 4 core values: trust, customer success, innovation, and equality. And we're examining this topic of having an office of ethical use to look at what this may be. There is no answer right now, and that's why these conversations are important, and it's important that we open our minds and realize that we may be doing things wrong, we may be doing things right, we may have to change some things, but it all comes down to learning, and it all comes down to education. And unfortunately, a lot of education is not that accessible. There's barriers for multiple reasons, whether it's cost, whether it's location, whether it's language, whether it's approachability. And so we have to, as companies, continue to invest in breaking down these barriers and making that education at the forefront. You look at, for example, with Trailhead, we teach people how to use our technology. We want to make sure that people are using it in great ways. And so that education is very important, and it's crucial because somebody may have the best of intentions, but they might not understand or might not be educated enough, and they might code something in or do something that is going to have bias or negatively impact others. So it's a very important topic. And companies need to just invest in their people, invest in skilling them up.
Yeah.
Sorry, just on that, just a follow-up, Sarah. When you look at the users of Trailhead, are there particular spikes in demand at the moment on the platform, particular subjects where the community is flooding to upskill?
Yes, and so Trailhead started for Salesforce skills, so the majority of learning is really for Salesforce skills. A lot of it with platform, a lot of it with how to learn automation, how to learn just basics of CRM as well, mobile app development. But we're adding other skills which are important, like Google Analytics, having Apple iOS Swift development. So there's a lot of people just wanting to generally get into technology because they're nervous about the future of their jobs. Another interesting point that y'all brought up was around GDPR and data privacy and security. What's interesting is that in Trailhead, we're GDPR compliant and all of that. It does provide, or it creates a conundrum a little bit if you don't have data to know what's going on. If I don't know the race of somebody, or if I don't know this information, it becomes harder to make sure that we're not putting bias in some ways, or to measure. So it's a very interesting, I'd be curious y'all's thoughts on that balance between collecting the data or not having the data and being able to use the data for good.
Yeah, that's definitely something that always comes up, even in research, because there are papers that show, for example, that using the sensitive attributes can help with ensuring fairness. But then at the same time, like when you're, for example, and even in healthcare data, right? If there are privacy issues with collecting sensitive information, but at the same time, there are certain treatments that should be tailored to certain groups of people, right? So this always comes up, even in machine learning research about fairness.
I think, Timnit, I've heard you talk before, maybe with Margaret recently, on some examples where in machine learning you can reverse the gradient in some ways. You can remove the impact of certain variables like race.
Yeah.
But the question there is, well, under what circumstances is that most appropriate, and how does that become a feature of uses down the line?
Yeah, it's so for example, there are use cases maybe where you want to know, you want to make sure that certain predictions that you have are this, they have parity. I mean, there's so many different ways of saying it for different groups of people. And one of the ways in which you might fulfill certain constraints that we have in the fairness literature is to do what you just described. But then there's other research, like for example, there's something called decoupled classifiers. There's even Meg's, you mentioned her work, her prior work, fairness through awareness, etc. That shows that, when you even have separate classifiers for different groups of people, sometimes that does better even in the fairness sense. So, I mean, I don't really have the perfect, the answer to this myself. I think it's very context dependent. I don't know. Sorry.
No, I wanted to go back to something that Sarah was talking about before, just on this skilling and education point, which is, and I think it's terrific that companies like Salesforce are doing things like Trailhead and actually training and providing ways for people to learn. You're starting to see other companies, AT&T is an example that's often quoted around what they're doing around retraining and education. Walmart is another with their Walmart Academies, where they've now had something like 600,000 people, that's a very large number, by the way,
wow,
actually go through their academies. But I think these are exceptions rather than the rule. I mean, because one of the things, if you look at the macro data, it actually shows that in most advanced economies, including the United States, both spending on on-the-job training by both public institutions, including the government, and private sector companies has actually been declining for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So, we don't spend very much to begin with as a society on on-the-job training, and it's actually been declining. And if you also look at, for example, how few incentives we put for companies and other organizations to actually invest in human capital, they're relatively low. So we've done a lot as a society to create all kinds of incentives for R&D investments. We give companies R&D tax credits. We encourage companies to invest in capital. We allow depreciation and a whole bunch of things. The extent to which we go in investing in all those other forms of capital, if you like, is far, far in excess than what we do on human capital. So I think one of the things that's going to need to change is how do we get not just the Salesforces and the AT&Ts, but everybody thinking about this question of investing in human capital. So
I'll add to that, and this is something that is very important, which is I talked about removing these barriers. Cost is a huge barrier. On Trailhead, it's part of our mission to remove that barrier. Trailhead's free. And we are inviting other companies, tech companies, to put their learning onto Trailhead so that it would be free. And we see this as, Salesforce is a purpose-driven company. And we want to invest in this. And we're creating all of this innovation. We're creating this technology. Right. It's our responsibility to create the education that goes with it. It's not in higher ed, it's not in all these other things, and that cost a ton of money. We're making it free, and we're inviting, and we have Google on the platform, we have Apple now on the platform, we have Amazon on the platform. We're just getting started. Yeah. And this is companies, tech companies, because if you're building this technology that's causing this innovation, you need to build the learning and make it free.
How do we overcome other accessibility barriers beyond just cost? Like, so the example we had earlier was of language. How do you make sure that the quality of Trailhead in multiple different languages, and not just the European main market languages, but in other languages where the need might be greatest, is as, at the same standard as you would give to the English language version?
It's a great question. Currently, we're 6 languages, English, French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, and Japanese, not Swahili. But we can expand that language library. And that's a translation exercise. It needs to be a good translation, not just a translate from here to there, which just takes people and time. Again, this is where people actually come into play. Other things that are important is some people actually learn in person, and we have a program around what we call BAM, which is be a multiplier, which is saying it's not just one person's responsibility, it's all of our responsibility. We put the training out there, and then you can then go and help others learn if you have that knowledge. Because if you want to see more women, more blacks, more Latinx, like if you want to see more LGBTQ people, we have to go out there and make them feel like they can come into the world, and they can come in and they can do it. And it's on us to take the training and go help other people learn, and not just leave it to a few people to do.
James, in the work that you've done at the McKinsey Global Institute, you have looked at at both the skills that have been required, but also the requirement of how you get to those skills in a certain way. So it's clear that we've got a pretty big problem on the hands between about a transition of maybe between 175 and 375 million order of jobs. And the work of the World Economic Forum shows that even when there's a good skill match between tasks that are in declining kind of demand and those in rising demand, to get the same wages and job security requires about 2 years of training under current paradigms to jump across that gap. 2 years of training is an incredible friction and a loss of opportunity. It's unsupportable for most families around the world. Like the vast majority of people cannot afford 2 years of just additional training because of an algorithm. How do we kind of innovate even faster and build on the success of Trailhead and other learning management systems to really open up this opportunity?
Well, I think we're only just learning how to innovate learning. I think, and I think
very meta.
No, but it's true, right? We're just learning how that happens. One of the fun things, and I can mention this because it's a nonprofit company. I'm on the board of the Khan Academy. We give free training and learning, it's a free learning platform. One of the things you learn with that is that the way people actually learn is not necessarily the way we've always thought people actually learn. In terms of, so we've always had this view that you start here, then you do this, then you do this. But you actually realize because of the way people come, for example, to the Khan Academy platform, they come from all different places. They may start with algebra, then go to geometry, or vice versa. And we're discovering that there's so much more that we don't know about how people actually learn fastest. So I think the more we can have more experimentation, I think we are going to learn, we're going to discover some new things about how people learn very, very quickly. But the thing I want to come back to, because we haven't touched on it very much in this conversation so far, is I think the learning and the education, I'm a huge proponent of that. It's a big part of it, but it won't solve all these issues, I don't think, because we're still going to have challenges around incomes and wages that may actually be more polarized through this transition than they are already. Because the way the wage question is interesting is often people come at it from the point of view of, well, we're not going to have any jobs, so we need UBI. Well, that's one way to think about it. But even when people are working, we already know that right now we're near full employment, it's as measured, and yet wages haven't moved very much. And we know that with these transitions, so if you look at anybody and everybody, all these research publications, including ours, that everybody's made, everybody predicts the same jobs to be declining and the same ones to be growing. If you look at almost every one of the ones that people describe as the growing ones, today they don't pay very much. Their wage structures, and many of the ones that are declining have tended to pay quite a bit because they're in many of the middle wage jobs. So just the occupational mix shift itself will necessarily put pressure on wages.
Should we be unionizing growing jobs? I mean, it might not be the most popular topic in this room, but as leading the civil society group at the World Economic Forum, I work very closely with our kind of social partners. a lot of the jobs that were destroyed in the shift away from manufacturing were pretty safe unionized jobs. The ones that are growing are in sectors that don't have as much collective action going on. Would McKinsey recommend that better collective action, better worker power in this would start to restore some of the conditions and the wages?
I don't know if I'd recommend that at all, but I think I'd certainly recommend the idea that we need to think about how wages work going forward, right? And it's not just a function of unionization or not. We just know that, for any unit of economic output, the mixture of labor inputs and capital inputs is just different. It's changed now. If you built a factory 100 years ago, almost all the inputs were labor inputs. They're not anymore, right? So I don't think that's a unionization or not problem. It's just the way that the economy works is quite different. And we just haven't reflected that in how we think about incomes and wages. And even in the other story that we all love to tell, because I think it's true, that we're not going to replace people, we're going to complement people. I believe that story, and that's actually true. That has a wide range of impacts on the wage front, right? So if you complement a highly skilled, person who's doing value-added work, the combination of that person working alongside a machine is wonderful. Their wages go up, productivity go up, that's great. But you've also got things at the other end of the spectrum where if you complement somebody and the machine is doing the value-added portions of that occupation, and what's left over is more de-skilled and many, many, many more people can do it, guess what's going to happen to the wages at that end of the spectrum? So I think even the story we tell around complementing people as opposed to replacing them also has this wide range of outcomes that we need to think about.
Because you're shifting then both the capital labor input ratio as well as the supply of labor, because you're opening up, and this is the story with ride sharing and taxi drivers. It's not just a story of regulation. In the case of the UK, it's also a story of de-skilling in some ways as
absolutely. I mean,
GPS.
Speaking of London, you remember what used to happen? I grew up in London, and when the black cab taxis in London, taxi drivers had to learn the knowledge, right, and have to pass this incredibly complicated test. Which basically was about how to learn the map of London and how to navigate effectively in London. Well, that was almost a labor supply limiting mechanism. Not that anybody designed it to be that, but when you suddenly then introduce, GPS, you've taken the one thing that actually was more labor supply limiting, and all somebody needs to do is just be able to drive. So guess how many people can do that? Even though they can't pass the knowledge. So I think we have to think about, even when we're complementing people with technology, what does that actually take, where does that take us? And it's more nuanced, to use a word we're using here a lot. It's
Absolutely.
more nuanced than just it's a happy outcome.
And I warned the audience at the beginning that they shouldn't come here looking for answers. So that's good, because we're having a framework of challenges, and I want to finish with a call to action from each of you, starting with you, Sarah. If you're sitting watching this and thinking, I could influence my organization, or I might have a startup and I want to do something, or I want to be an activist in some way. What should people be doing, from your perspective, about making sure that the future of work in the context of AI, in the context of the fourth industrial revolution, is that much little bit better thanks to their actions? What would you be calling for people to practically do tomorrow or next week?
Yes, thank you, Nick. My quick call to action would be to take action. And it's that simply where you need to educate yourself on equality, unconscious bias, all of this stuff. And you need to speak up if you see that happening. And then you need to take action to participate, whether it's in local schools, local communities, to help people learn these skills. It was a great example of the taxi drivers in London and getting the GPS, because then they need to learn maybe all of the great restaurants and be more concierge type of service. So it's a way to always be innovating and keeping that mindset. And so it's just always be learning is my would be my one takeaway. And then for people that are hiring, be open-minded. So don't necessarily require college degrees on your job openings. Be willing to invest in skilling people up and reskilling your teams, instead of just having very rigid constraints around your hiring practices.
Thank you. James, what can people do? What should they be doing?
Well, I think we should actually embrace these technologies even faster than we are already, partly because they'll drive economic growth, productivity, which actually, by the way, is going to be the biggest thing to actually drive creation of jobs. At the same time, we need to work on all these challenges. So I would hate answers that says that suggests that we should slow this down and roll everything back. I don't think that's helpful.
Timnit.
So I would say that we should all kind of, even though we are working in companies and whatever institutions we all have, each of us has a responsibility. And so, for example, the Google Maven employee revolt is a great example of how each employee kind of took down this project, and it wasn't like high up people or senior people or something like this. So that's just what I want to say to everybody, that like even if we're researchers or technologists or any other profession, we have to always think about the societal impacts and the political landscape. Yeah.
I guess from me, in thanking everyone for being here today, and as well for thanking Sarah, James, and Timnit for joining us, I want to say that we think about the future of work, and we often talk about it as if it's some externally determined thing that's coming at us, right, that we can wrap our arms around and it's predetermined. The future of work is determined by us. It's the investment decisions that you make in yourself, in your organizations. It's the decisions about how you deploy technology and whether you even care or think about the bias and the impact that could have, which will shape the future and the lives for so much of us, let alone the voting and the policy and the regulation and the community action, which has a massively uncertain and outsized impact on technology, as we've seen. So thank you very much, and I look forward to co-creating the future of work with you all. Have a great rest of your time here in Dreamforce.